The dinner party at Chasen's was the kind of evening that defined 1956 Hollywood. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over white tablecloths, and the city's most powerful figures gathered in private rooms where deals were made over filet mignon and martinis. Marilyn Monroe sat near the center of the long table, wearing a simple black dress that somehow outshone every diamond in the room. She had been invited by the studio to celebrate the success of her latest picture, though she understood these gatherings were never really about celebration. They were about power, measurement, and the subtle games men played when they thought themselves untouchable. The conversation flowed easily at first. There was talk of box office numbers, upcoming productions, and which European actresses might be brought over for the fall season. Marilyn listened more than she spoke, occasionally offering a soft laugh or a thoughtful comment that surprised the men who still expected her to be nothing more than the blonde they'd manufactured. She had learned to read rooms like this, to sense the currents beneath polite conversation. Tonight, something felt different. There was a tension in the air, a kind of anticipation that made her fingers rest lightly on her water glass, ready for something she couldn't yet name. What happened at Chasen's changed how Hollywood's most powerful men saw Marilyn Monroe forever. But this story, and dozens like it, were buried by the industry for decades. Subscribe now to uncover the moments they didn't want you to know. The real Hollywood. The untold confrontations. The silent victories. Because the truth is always more powerful than the legend. At the head of the table sat Marcus Wellman, a studio executive whose influence stretched across 3 major production companies. He was a man who had built empires on other people's dreams, crushing some and elevating others based on calculations only he understood. His face had the permanent tan of someone who spent weekends on yachts, and his eyes held the cold assessment of a jeweler, examining a stone for flaws. He had been drinking steadily since they arrived, his laughter growing louder with each passing course. Marilyn had worked with men like him before, men who believed their success gave them permission to say anything to anyone. The moment came between the main course and dessert, during that lull when cigars were lit and the formality of the meal dissolved into something more dangerous. Someone had mentioned a new starlet, barely 18, who reminded them of Marilyn when she first arrived in Hollywood. The comparison was meant as a compliment, but Wellman seized it like an opportunity he'd been waiting for all evening. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his scotch, and his voice cut through the other conversations with practiced ease. "The difference is," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "this girl actually had a family. She doesn't come with all that baggage." The table went quiet in the way that rooms do when something unforgivable has just been spoken aloud. A few executives looked down at their plates. Others glanced at Marilyn, waiting to see how she would react. Wellman wasn't finished. He smiled. That particular smile powerful men wear when they're about to disguise cruelty as humor. "No offense, sweetheart," he continued, gesturing toward Marilyn with his glass. "But the studio spent a fortune trying to clean up your past. Orphanages, foster homes, all those sad little stories. This new girl? Clean slate. Much easier to market." He said it as if he were discussing a product, as if her childhood were nothing more than an inconvenient manufacturing defect. Inside her chest, Marilyn felt the familiar tightening, the one that started in her throat and spread to her stomach like ice water. She recognized this feeling from 1,000 moments before, sitting in a social worker's office as they discussed her future, like she wasn't there, standing in a foster home while adults debated whether to keep her, hearing whispers in casting offices about whether she was worth the trouble. For years she had absorbed these blows in silence, letting them confirm what some part of her had always feared, that she was fundamentally damaged, fundamentally unworthy of the respect given to people born into easier circumstances. But something had changed in her over recent years. Perhaps it was the therapy she'd quietly pursued, the books she'd consumed in hotel rooms between shoots, or simply the accumulated weight of surviving things that should have destroyed her. She understood now that cruelty revealed more about the person delivering it than the person receiving it. Wellman's words weren't truth. They were weapons, chosen specifically because he knew they would hurt. He had said these things not because they needed to be said, but because he wanted to remind everyone at the table of his power, his ability to wound without consequence. And he had chosen her past because men like him always reached for the wounds they thought were easiest to reopen. Marilyn set down her fork with deliberate care. The small sound of silver against china seemed loud in the silence. She didn't look at Wellman immediately. Instead, she took a slow breath, the kind she'd learned in acting classes, the kind that centered you before a difficult scene. She could feel eyes on her from every direction, some sympathetic, some curious, others entertained by the possibility of drama. They were all waiting to see if she would cry, if she would storm out, if she would prove every assumption they'd ever made about the fragile blonde who couldn't handle the rough world of Hollywood business. She would not give them that satisfaction. When she finally lifted her gaze to meet Wellman's, her eyes were steady. There was no anger in them, no tears, no pleading. There was something else, a kind of ancient sadness mixed with a strength he clearly hadn't expected. "Mr. Wellman," she said, and her voice was soft but carried perfectly in the hushed room. "I've noticed that powerful men often mistake cruelty for honesty. They think because they can say something, they should." She paused, letting the words settle. "But there's a difference between being honest and being brutal. One requires courage. The other just requires power over someone you think can't fight back." The shift in the room was immediate. Wellman's smile faltered. He had expected her to shrink, to laugh it off, to play along with the joke he'd made at her expense. Instead, she had named exactly what he'd done, stripped it of its disguise as casual banter. One of the other executives, a man named Richard who had always been kind to Marilyn, cleared his throat uncomfortably. A woman at the far end of the table, a costume designer who had known Marilyn for years, nodded almost imperceptibly. Wellman tried to recover. "I was just joking," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "You know how it is." "I do know how it is," Marilyn replied, and now there was something unmistakably firm beneath the softness. "I know that some people believe their position gives them the right to use other people's pain as entertainment. I know that my past, my real past, the one I actually lived, involves things that were done to me, not by me. I was a child with no control over where I lived or who took care of me." She hadn't raised her voice even slightly, but every word landed with precision. "The fact that you would use that as a weapon tells me more about your character than it does about mine. And I think everyone at this table knows that." The silence that followed was different from the one before. This wasn't the holding your breath silence of waiting for scandal. This was the uncomfortable silence of people realizing they'd just witnessed something that couldn't be undone. Wellman had been exposed, not through screaming or tears, but through simple, clear truth. He had meant to diminish her by referencing her poverty, her abandonment, her lack of the proper pedigree Hollywood usually demanded. Instead, she had revealed that these experiences had given her a moral clarity he would never possess. She had survived things he couldn't imagine, and that survival had made her stronger than his inherited wealth and institutional power could ever make him. A producer from Fox named David Brenner was the first to speak. "Marcus," he said quietly, "that was out of line." It was a small intervention, but significant. In Hollywood, these men rarely called each other out. They protected their own, maintained the unspoken agreements that kept power circulating among the same hands. But Brenner had daughters, and perhaps he'd seen in that moment what it meant to weaponize a woman's past against her. Or perhaps he simply recognized that Marilyn had won this exchange so decisively that staying silent would align him with obvious cruelty. Either way, his words broke the spell that had held everyone frozen. Others began to murmur agreement. An actress Marilyn barely knew reached over and touched her hand briefly, a gesture of solidarity that meant more than any words could. Wellman looked around the table and seemed to realize, perhaps for the first time in his privileged life, that he had miscalculated badly. He had thought his power was absolute, that he could say anything without consequence. But power in Hollywood was a strange thing, built on reputation and relationships as much as money. And he had just shown everyone in that room who he really was, when he thought he could be cruel without cost. "I apologize," he said finally, but the words came out stiff and resentful. It was the apology of someone who'd been caught, not someone who understood what they'd done wrong. Marilyn looked at him for a long moment. She could have accepted graciously, made it easier for everyone, Let the evening move on as if nothing had happened. That's what the old Marilyn might have done. The one who thought she had to make everyone comfortable, who carried the burden of other people's bad behavior. But that Marilyn was gone, or at least transformed into someone who understood that accepting false apologies only enabled more cruelty. "Thank you," she said simply, acknowledging the apology without absolving him. Then she turned to Richard, the kind executive, and asked him about a script she'd heard he was developing. Her tone was pleasant, engaged, as if the last few minutes hadn't happened. It was a masterful move. She had made her point, set her boundary, and then demonstrated that she could move forward without carrying the weight of his cruelty. She wouldn't dwell on it, wouldn't let it derail her evening, wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing that he'd wounded her, even as she'd defeated him. The conversation slowly resumed, but something fundamental had changed. Marilyn left the dinner party early, citing an early call time the next morning. As she gathered her things, several people made a point of saying goodbye to her warmly, their voices carrying an extra note of respect that hadn't been there when she arrived. Richard walked her to her car, his hand briefly touching her elbow in a gesture of support. "That took courage," he said quietly. She smiled at him, that real smile that few people ever saw. "No," she replied. "Courage is thinking you might fail. What I did in there was just refuse to disappear." She meant it. For years, she had made herself smaller to fit into the spaces Hollywood created for her. Tonight, she had simply occupied the space she deserved. The story of that dinner spread through Hollywood with the speed that only industry gossip can achieve. By the next morning, people who hadn't been there were calling friends who had, trying to piece together exactly what had happened. The accounts varied in details, but agreed on the essentials. Marcus Wellman had tried to humiliate Marilyn Monroe by throwing her difficult past in her face, and she had responded not with hysteria or hurt feelings, but with a dignity and moral authority that had left him looking small and mean. The story particularly resonated with actresses who had faced similar moments, who knew what it was like to have their vulnerabilities weaponized by men who believed their power was limitless. Within the industry, the incident changed something subtle but significant. Directors who had dismissed Marilyn as merely beautiful began to reconsider. Writers who had crafted roles assuming she could only play one note started thinking about her differently. The response hadn't just been impressive, it had revealed an intelligence and emotional maturity that contradicted the carefully constructed image of the dizzy blonde. People began to remember other moments when they'd underestimated her, other times when she'd surprised them. The narrative began to shift, slowly, from tragic beauty to something more complex and truthful. For Wellman, the consequences were quieter but no less real. He remained powerful, wealthy, and connected, but something had tarnished his reputation in ways money couldn't polish away. At parties and meetings, there was a new wariness around him. People remembered what he'd done, how he'd chosen to wield his power. When he tried to make similar jokes in the future, the laughter was thinner, more nervous. Other executives began to wonder what he might say about them, what cruelties he might deploy if it served his purposes. He had revealed himself not as a hard-nosed businessman, which Hollywood respected, but as someone who found entertainment in other people's pain, which was something else entirely. Marilyn continued working, continued navigating an industry that was rarely kind to women, and especially unkind to women who had her particular combination of beauty and ambition. But something in her had solidified that night at Chasen's. She had proven to herself that she could face cruelty without crumbling, that she could set boundaries without losing control, that her past, all of it, every foster home and hungry night and moment of abandonment, didn't make her less than anyone else. If anything, it had given her a strength that people born into comfort would never understand. She had survived, and survival itself was a kind of victory. In the years that followed, people would remember that dinner party for different reasons. Some would recall it as entertainment, a brief drama in an industry built on drama. Others would see it as a turning point, a moment when Marilyn Monroe demonstrated that she was more than the image Hollywood had created for her. But for Marilyn herself, it became a reference point, proof that she could face the worst of what Hollywood had to offer and remain standing, remain herself. The orphanages and foster homes, the hunger and loneliness and fear, hadn't broken her. They had shaped her into someone who understood pain deeply enough to refuse to pass it along. The incident also changed how other vulnerable people in the industry thought about their own power. If Marilyn Monroe could face down a studio executive without losing her composure or her dignity, perhaps they could too. The story became, in its own way, a kind of blueprint for how to respond to institutional cruelty, not with matching cruelty, not with victimhood, but with clear, calm truth-telling. She had named what Wellman did, explained why it was wrong, and then moved on without apology or shame. It was a lesson in how strength could look different than most people imagined, how quiet control could be more powerful than loud confrontation. Years later, when people wrote about Marilyn Monroe, they often focused on the tragedy, the difficult end, the ways Hollywood consumed her. But those who were in that room at Chasen's in 1956 remembered something else. They remembered a woman who had been dealt a terrible hand in childhood and had somehow transformed that pain into wisdom instead of bitterness. They remembered someone who understood cruelty intimately and chose not to replicate it. They remembered the moment when a powerful man tried to make her small, and she responded by showing everyone in the room what real dignity looked like. The Hollywood machine continued as it always had, creating stars and destroying them, elevating some while crushing others under its massive wheels. But for those who witnessed what happened that night, there was a before and after. Before, they might have laughed at a joke like Wellman's or at least stayed silent. After, there was a new awareness of the cost of that laughter, the damage done by careless cruelty disguised as humor. Marilyn hadn't changed the entire industry with one quiet confrontation, but she had changed that room, those people, in ways that rippled outward in small but meaningful circles. In the privacy of her own apartment later that night, Marilyn had allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. She had cried, not the public tears people expected from her, but the private tears of someone processing old pain that had been deliberately reopened. But even in that moment of vulnerability, she felt something new: pride. She had stood up for herself in a way she never could have years earlier. She had claimed her story instead of letting someone else use it against her. The girl who had been shuffled between foster homes would have recognized the woman she'd become, would have been proud of her, would have understood that this was what survival looked like when you refused to let it break your spirit. The story of that dinner party at Chasen's became part of Hollywood lore, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy. Some versions made Marilyn's response more dramatic than it was. Others softened Wellman's cruelty or erased it entirely. But the people who were actually there carried the true story with them, a reminder that power had limits, that cruelty had consequences, and that dignity could be the most devastating response to humiliation. They had seen what happened when someone chose to respond to weaponized pain with moral clarity, instead of matching cruelty with cruelty. For Marilyn herself, it was one moment in a life full of moments, both beautiful and brutal. She didn't dwell on it or use it to define herself, but sometimes, in other difficult situations, she would remember how it felt to set that boundary, to speak that truth, to refuse to shrink. She would remember that she had the strength to face cruelty without becoming cruel, to acknowledge pain without being destroyed by it. The foster homes and orphanages, the abandonment and hunger and fear, all of it had happened. All of it was true. But it wasn't a weapon someone else could use against her anymore. It was her story, and she had claimed it back. In the end, what happened at Chasen's that night was both smaller and larger than it seemed. It was smaller because it was just one conversation in one restaurant in one moment of Hollywood history. But it was larger because it represented something fundamental about what it means to maintain dignity in the face of institutional cruelty, to refuse the role of victim while acknowledging real victimization, to transform pain into wisdom instead of rage. Marilyn Monroe had been many things in her life: actress, icon, symbol, commodity. But in that moment, responding to Marcus Wellman's cruelty with clear, calm authority, she was something else entirely. She was simply a person who had survived terrible things and refused to let anyone make her feel ashamed of having survived. The dinner party ended. The guests went home. Hollywood continued its endless cycle of creation and destruction. But in that private room at Chasen's, something had shifted. A line had been drawn, a boundary had been set, and everyone who witnessed it understood, whether they admitted it or not, that they had seen something rare. A moment of genuine courage that looked nothing like the Hollywood version. A demonstration of strength that came not from power or wealth or status, but from the hard-won knowledge that comes from surviving things that should have destroyed you and choosing somehow to remain kind anyway. Years would pass. Memories would fade. The details would blur and transform in the retelling. But some truths remained sharp and clear. On that night in 1956, Marcus Wellman had tried to humiliate Marilyn Monroe by using her painful past as a weapon, and Marilyn Monroe had responded with a dignity and moral clarity that transformed the moment from one of victimization to one of quiet triumph. She hadn't shouted or cried or stormed out. She had simply refused to disappear. And in Hollywood, where women were expected to shrink and fade and eventually vanish, that refusal was revolutionary. That refusal was everything.